Cameras clicked, pens hovered above notepads. Every eye was locked on the stage where Kellyanne Conway sat, chin tilted high, her trademark smirk fixed firmly in place. She had been here before, countless times in fact, armed with polished talking points and an uncanny ability to twist words into weapons. She radiated confidence, almost arrogance, as if this exchange was nothing more than another chance to showcase her mastery of spin. And then, it happened. Jasmine Crockett, sitting across from her with a calm poise that belied the fire in her, eyes leaned forward ever so slightly. With precision sharpened by years of fighting uphill battles, she delivered a line so piercing, so devastatingly direct, that it sliced through Conway's argument like a hot knife through butter. The words were simple, but the timing, the rhythm, the sheer conviction in her voice made them land like thunder. A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Then, as the weight of Crockett's rebuttal sank in, the gasp transformed into a wave of cheers and applause that rolled across the room. Some people leapt to their feet, unable to contain their excitement. Others pounded the tables, laughter bubbling out as if finally, someone had said what they had all been waiting to hear. Conway blinked. Just for a moment, the smug veneer faltered. Her eyes darted, searching for a comeback, a pivot, anything to regain control, but it was too late. The momentum had shifted. Jasmine Crockett owned the room now. It wasn't just the words, it was the energy. Crockett's voice carried the weight of every truth-teller who had ever stood up against power, every underdog who refused to be silenced, and the audience felt it in their bones. They weren't just watching a debate, they were witnessing a moment that would live on in highlight reels, memes, and hashtags for days to come. But here's the thing. That single clapback wasn't the end of it. It was only the beginning. Because what happened in the seconds that followed didn't just silence Kellyanne Conway. It electrified the entire room, leaving even her staunchest supporters stunned into silence. To truly understand the magnitude of what unfolded, you have to step back from the applause, the gasps, and the cheering crowd. Because this wasn't just another heated exchange between two political figures. This was a confrontation set against the backdrop of America's ongoing struggle over truth, integrity, and the very meaning of leadership. The event itself was billed as a forum, a stage where competing visions for the country could be laid bare. For the organizers, it was meant to be a showcase of ideas, a chance to strip away the filters of television soundbites and let the raw essence of political conviction shine. But everyone in the room knew what was really at stake: credibility. Whose voice would resonate? Whose narrative would dominate? Whose version of reality would the audience walk away believing? Kellyanne Conway entered the forum with every advantage in her corner. Her reputation as one of America's most skilled political operatives preceded her. She had weathered interviews with the toughest journalists, sparred with late-night hosts, and spun narratives so quickly and convincingly that entire news cycles bent around her. She was, in many ways, the embodiment of political wordplay, polished, relentless, and armed with the kind of rhetorical agility that had made her a household name. For Conway, this wasn't just about winning an argument, it was about reinforcing the idea that spin could still triumph over substance, that slick talking points could still drown out inconvenient truths. Every sentence she delivered dripped with the confidence of someone who had beaten this game before. But across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, younger, hungrier, less seasoned in the games of Washington but forged in a different kind of fire. For Crockett, this wasn't about theatrics. It was about calling out hypocrisy in real time, about refusing to let gaslighting pass as logic. She knew that in rooms like this, silence was surrender, and surrender was never an option. The stakes were enormous, because Conway's argument, if left unchallenged, would ripple far beyond that forum. It wasn't just words in a room. It was ammunition for headlines, for social media threads, for dinner table debates across America. Left unrefuted, her spin would harden into truth for millions who only caught the highlights. And that was precisely why dismantling it mattered. This was about more than Crockett versus Conway. It was about authenticity versus performance, honesty versus manipulation. The rising generation of leaders versus the old guard of political operatives who believed they could still dictate the story unchallenged. And as Conway leaned in, delivering her argument with a tone of smug inevitability, many in the audience likely assumed the outcome was already written. After all, hadn't Conway made a career of leaving her opponent scrambling? Wasn't she the one who always managed to twist the knife and walk away smiling? But that's where they underestimated Jasmine Crockett, because what no one in that room expected was that Conway's carefully built argument, the one she had stacked like a tower of cards, would be toppled in seconds by a single, razor-sharp rebuttal. Crockett wasn't intimidated, and she wasn't playing defense. She was about to flip the script entirely, and when she did, the energy in the room shifted like a storm rolling in. No one expected what was about to happen next, until Crockett turned the tables. To understand why this clash mattered so deeply, you have to know who Kellyanne Conway is. Not just the persona on stage that night, but the arsenal she carried with her, sharpened over decades of political combat. Kellyanne didn't stumble into the spotlight, she engineered her way there. For years, she had been one of the most skilled strategists in Washington, a master of sound bites and spin who could walk into a hostile interview and walk out with the upper hand. Her talent wasn't policy or even persuasion in the traditional sense, it was manipulation. Conway could take a hard question, twist it in real time, and send it ricocheting back at her opponent until they looked flustered, foolish, and defeated. Reporters hated it, networks dreaded it, but audiences, they remembered it. And in politics, that was power. She was the architect of what critics called verbal jujitsu. If pressed on facts, she would pivot to feelings. If cornered with logic, she would reframe the terms of the debate entirely. It was Conway who popularized phrases that blurred the line between truth and fiction, creating a fog where her opponents often suffocated. She was the personification of political stagecraft, smooth, unshakable, and media-savvy to the core. Her opponents had learned the hard way. Time and again, when lesser-prepared figures squared off against her, they left the stage diminished. Some fumbled with papers, trying to fact-check her in real time. Others lost their cool, raising their voices in frustration, while Conway smiled, serenely, as if she had been waiting for exactly that slip. She thrived in chaos, because chaos made her look composed, and that track record fed her confidence, or rather, her arrogance. By the time she faced Jasmine Crockett, Conway wasn't just expecting to win, she was expecting a rout. In her eyes, Crockett was another upstart, another young politician eager to prove herself but hopelessly out of her depth against a seasoned media warrior. Conway carried herself with the assurance of someone who had seen this movie before, and always knew how it ended. That night her demeanor told the whole story. Arms folded, smirk firmly in place. Every word she delivered was coded in condescension, as if to remind Crockett, the audience, and anyone watching at home. I've done this 1,000 times. You can't touch me. But beneath that polished exterior was something more dangerous. The assumption that her old tricks would still work, that her reputation alone would rattle her opponent, that the same rehearsed pivots, the same dismissive tone, the same sly grin would once again throw her adversary off balance. And in fairness, it usually did. Conway's skill wasn't that she was right, it was that she was relentless. She didn't need to win with truth, she only needed to survive with confidence. And against opponents who hesitated, stumbled, or second-guessed themselves, survival looked like victory. But here's the thing about arsenals. They only work if the enemy hasn't figured out your weapons. Conway's verbal jujitsu, her carefully honed dismissiveness, her aura of inevitability, all of it relied on the element of intimidation. It relied on the other person blinking first. What Conway didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't wired that way. Crockett didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't mistake confidence for strength. And she wasn't about to let Conway's arsenal of spin dominate the moment. For the first time in years, Conway was about to find herself on the other end of a strategy she couldn't out-talk, out-smirk, or out-spin. And when it happened, it wouldn't just rattle her composure. It would shake the very foundation of the myth she had built her career upon. Because what Conway didn't account for was a rising voice who wouldn't flinch. If Kellyanne Conway's arsenal was forged in the backrooms of Washington and polished in the glare of cable news studios, Jasmine Crockett's fire came from somewhere very different. The streets, the classrooms, and the communities that too often found themselves ignored. Jasmine Crockett's story isn't one of privilege or easy access to power. It's a story of grit, of defiance, of a young woman who decided early on that silence was never an option. Raised in an environment where speaking up wasn't just encouraged but necessary for survival, Crockett learned to sharpen her voice before she ever set foot in a courtroom or a congressional hearing. Words weren't luxuries, They were weapons, shields, lifelines. As a child, she saw firsthand the inequities that defined daily life for so many families like hers. Schools underfunded, neighborhoods overlooked, voices dismissed. And instead of becoming numb to that injustice, she let it burn inside her, fueling a determination that would shape every choice she made. While others might have seen obstacles, Crockett saw battles worth fighting, and she refused to back down from any of them. When she pursued law, it wasn't for prestige, it was for service. As a public defender, Crockett stood beside people who didn't have the money, connections, or power to defend themselves. She stared down prosecutors who underestimated her, judges who questioned her, and opponents who thought they could bulldoze over her arguments. Time after time, she proved them wrong, not with arrogance, but with preparation, precision, and an almost volcanic passion for justice. Those courtroom battles became her training ground. Every dismissive smirk from an opposing attorney, every attempt to belittle her, every condescending "you're too young" or "you don't understand how this works" only sharpened her resolve. She didn't just argue cases. She fought for dignity, for fairness, for the principle that every voice mattered, even if the system was designed to drown it out. And that's where her style began to take form. Crockett didn't waste words. She didn't ramble. She learned early that in rooms stacked against her, every sentence had to hit like a hammer. Her debating style was a reflection of her journey, concise, fiery, and cutting straight to the truth. When others circled around the issue, she went directly to the heart of it. When others padded their points with jargon, she stripped hers, down to clarity and conviction. But Crockett's fire wasn't just professional, it was personal. She carried with her the weight of community, the pride of representing those who rarely got a seat at the table, and the knowledge that every victory meant more than just a notch on her resume. It meant proving that the system could be challenged, that power could be confronted, and that voices like hers could not only be heard but could dominate. In politics, Crockett quickly became known for the same qualities that defined her legal career: authenticity and ferocity. She wasn't polished in the way DC insiders expected. She didn't rehearse sound bites in the mirror or dilute her fire to make others comfortable. She spoke plainly, with a conviction that resonated far beyond political circles. And that authenticity made her dangerous, because unlike Conway, Crockett wasn't playing a game. She was living a mission. Every setback she endured, every dismissal she faced, only added fuel to her fire. Critics called her too blunt, too aggressive, too unwilling to play nice. But what they failed to realize was that Crockett's refusal to play by their rules wasn't a weakness. It was her greatest strength. Where others conformed, she disrupted. Where others hesitated, she charged forward. And so, when she walked onto that stage opposite Kellyanne Conway, she didn't carry the arsenal of a spin doctor. She carried something far more powerful. The lived experience of fighting uphill battles, the scars of taking on entrenched systems, and the sharpened steel of a voice that had never once backed down. To Conway, this was another sparring match in a long career of verbal victories. To Crockett, it was something bigger. It was a chance to remind America that truth could still triumph over spin, that authenticity could still outshine arrogance, and that courage, even when delivered in a single searing sentence, could change the entire energy of a room. This was the Crockett fire, born in struggle, refined in service, unleashed in moments where everything was on the line. And all of that prepared her for this very moment, the one where history leaned in to listen. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's first strike didn't last long. Kellyanne Conway, a veteran of countless verbal battles, knew she had to regain control, and fast. Her smirk returned, thinner this time, but determined. She leaned forward, voice dripping with confidence, and launched into a counterattack. Her words came rapid fire, each one designed not to clarify but to confuse. She twisted data, plucked quotes out of context, and wove together fragments of half-truths like a magician pulling scarves from thin air. To the untrained ear, it sounded convincing. To the unprepared opponent, it was overwhelming. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't untrained, and she certainly wasn't unprepared. As Conway spoke, Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't even raise an eyebrow. Instead, she listened, steady, poised, and utterly unshaken. The contrast was striking. Conway's words tumbled over one another in a rush to dominate, while Crockett sat in stillness, her silence a kind of defiance. It was as if she were letting Conway build her tower higher and higher, brick by brick, knowing full well how fragile its foundation really was. The audience, meanwhile, could feel the tension coil tighter with each passing second. Some leaned forward in their seats, eager to see how Crockett would respond. Others shook their heads at Conway's theatrics, but even they couldn't deny her command of the moment. The clash was no longer about policy or principle, it was about presence. Two very different styles colliding in real time, the outcome hanging in the balance. And then, the verbal fencing began. Conway struck first, a dismissive jab about Crockett's experience, suggesting she was out of her depth. Crockett parried with calm precision, pointing out a glaring inconsistency in Conway's claim. The audience murmured, impressed. Conway lunged again, this time framing Crockett as naive, painting herself as the seasoned veteran. Crockett countered with a question so sharp that Conway hesitated before answering, a stumble just noticeable enough to draw whispers from the crowd. It was like watching two swordsmen circle each other, blades clashing, sparks flying. Each sentence became a strike, each rebuttal a block. The energy in the room was electric, every exchange raising the stakes higher and higher. But beneath Conway's polished attacks, a pattern was emerging. She was repeating herself, recycling familiar pivots, leaning on the same old tricks, and the more she pushed, the clearer it became that she was rattled. Her smile tightened, her tone sharpened. She talked faster, filling the air with more words, as if drowning the conversation would help her win it. Crockett, on the other hand, grew steadier with each exchange. Her voice didn't rise, her cadence didn't falter. She was waiting, biding her time, letting Conway expend her energy, letting the audience see the difference between noise and clarity. And then, the moment arrived. Conway, pressing too hard, twisted one fact too far, her argument stretching past credibility. A ripple of unease crossed the crowd. They heard it too, and in that opening, Crockett leaned forward, eyes locked, ready to deliver the strike she had been holding. The room seemed to hold its breath, every camera, every pen, every gaze fixed on her. Then, in a single breath, Crockett unleashed the line that cracked the entire facade. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. Kellyanne Conway had just twisted the facts one step too far, her argument stretched thin, her voice rising with urgency that betrayed just how desperately she needed control of the room. The audience shifted uneasily. Even those sympathetic to Conway's usual tactics sensed something was off. And then Jasmine Crockett struck. She didn't rush. She didn't flail. She didn't match Conway's frantic energy with more noise. Instead, she leaned in just slightly, lowered her voice and delivered a single, concise rebuttal that sliced through the fog like lightning tearing across a midnight sky. It wasn't a monologue. It wasn't a rehearsed speech. It was one sentence, measured, deliberate, devastating. The pause before it landed only heightened its power. Crockett let the silence build, let Conway's last words echo and collapse under their own weight. Then, with flawless timing, she spoke. The effect was instantaneous. Gasps shot through the audience, sharp and collective. A beat later, the room erupted. Cheers, applause, laughter, even the sound of people pounding the tables in disbelief. Some rose to their feet without even realizing it, compelled by the force of the moment. It wasn't just agreement, it was catharsis. As if the entire room had been waiting for someone, anyone, to puncture the balloon of spin and arrogance that Conway had been inflating for years. And Crockett had done it in seconds. Conway froze. For the first time that night, maybe for the first time in a long time, her face betrayed her. The smirk faltered. Her eyes widened, then narrowed, then darted, searching for footing. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing coherent came out. A stammer, a half-formed phrase. She was rattled. It was the kind of silence more deafening than a shout. The cameras captured everything. Crockett's steady gaze, Conway's unraveling composure, the crowd's raucous reaction. In an age where moments are clipped, shared and immortalized online within minutes, this was pure digital gold. The hashtags practically wrote themselves. Inside the room, the ripple was unmistakable. Reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, their pens scribbling furiously to capture the quote. Staffers in the back covered their mouths, some with barely contained laughter. Even political veterans hardened by years of debates and spin couldn't help but grin. It was the kind of takedown that didn't just score points. It shifted momentum entirely. Conway's arsenal, once so formidable, lay scattered at her feet. Every weapon she had deployed, every trick she had perfected over decades, suddenly seemed obsolete against the power of Crockett's precision. The brevity was the brilliance. While Conway's strategy had always been to overwhelm with words, Crockett had undone her with fewer than a dozen. Where Conway relied on drowning opponents in noise, Crockett had harnessed silence. The pause before the strike, the calm delivery, the thunderous aftermath. Seconds. That's all it took. The room was no longer Conway's to control. Every eye, every ear, every ounce of energy now belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She didn't gloat, didn't stretch the moment with unnecessary elaboration. She simply let the reaction wash over her, her composure unshaken, her eyes fixed forward. That restraint only amplified her victory. Conway tried to recover. She cleared her throat, adjusted her posture, forced the smirk back onto her face. But the damage was already done. Her words stumbled, her cadence faltered. For someone whose strength had always been unshakable confidence, the cracks were glaring. Each attempt to regain control felt more desperate than the last, and the audience knew it. They could smell weakness, and they rewarded it with more laughter, more cheers, more applause every time Conway tried to pivot. And through it all, Crockett remained poised. The calm in the storm she herself had unleashed. The psychology of the moment couldn't be overstated. Politics isn't just about facts. It's about dominance, presence, narrative. In that instant, the narrative flipped completely. Conway was no longer the seasoned strategist exposing the inexperience of her opponent. She was the veteran undone by a newcomer's clarity. The giant slain not by a sword but by a single perfectly placed stone. The myth of Conway's invincibility, that aura she had carried through countless interviews and debates, crumbled before the cameras. And the crowd knew they were witnessing history, not just another exchange of words. It was the kind of moment that gets replayed again and again, each viewing delivering the same rush of disbelief and satisfaction. A mic drop so clean, so devastating, that no amount of spin could erase it. And in that moment, it wasn't just about Conway losing ground. It was about something larger, about truth cutting through deception, about authenticity toppling arrogance, about a new voice refusing to be drowned out by an old playbook. As the applause finally began to settle, as Conway fumbled for her next line, and as Crockett sat steady, unshaken, the meaning was clear. In that instant, the myth of Conway's invincibility shattered. The eruption inside the room was only the beginning. What unfolded in those seconds between Jasmine Crockett's mic drop rebuttal and Kellyanne Conway's faltering silence did not stay confined to the four walls of that forum. Within minutes, it spilled out into the digital bloodstream of the nation. Clips of the moment shot across social media like sparks catching dry grass. First, shaky cell phone videos uploaded by attendees, then crisp, high-definition cuts from media outlets. Before long, the soundbite was everywhere, replayed, remixed, and captioned in 1,000 different ways. On Twitter, hashtags trended. Within the hour, Crockett clapback, spin shattered, seconds to silence. On TikTok, users set her words to music, creating viral edits that racked up millions of views overnight. On Instagram, reels of the crowd's eruption spread with captions like, "This is what speaking truth to power looks like." The commentary came just as fast. Political analysts rushed to weigh in, some marveling at Crockett's composure, others noting how quickly Conway lost her footing. This was a generational moment, one commentator declared. The passing of the torch from the old guard of spin politics to a new era of unapologetic authenticity. Even Conway's usual defenders struggled to spin the exchange in her favor. Her pause, her stammer, the visible crack in her polished demeanor, all of it had been captured in high definition. No amount of explanation could undo the raw impact of the footage. Attempts to dismiss Crockett's rebuttal as grandstanding only made the contrast clearer. Conway looked rattled while Crockett looked fearless. Late-night hosts turned the moment into comedy gold. One replayed Conway's stammer on loop, each time cutting back to Crockett's unflinching stare. Another joked, "Kellyanne's arguments lasted longer than most Netflix shows, but Jasmine ended them in less time than it takes to microwave popcorn." Audiences roared, and Crockett's name reached millions who had never heard it before. But it wasn't just comedy. It was culture. Memes flooded Facebook and Reddit. Crockett depicted as a sword-wielding knight, Conway as a collapsing house of cards. Fans turned her rebuttal into t-shirt slogans, GIFs, even ringtone soundbites. Supporters hailed her as the embodiment of courage, the fresh voice America needed, and beneath the humor and celebration was something deeper: validation. Viewers who had long felt exhausted by the endless spin of political operatives suddenly saw in Crockett a reflection of their own frustration and their own hope. She wasn't polished to the point of detachment. She wasn't playing a character. She was raw, authentic, and unwilling to let deceit pass unchallenged. That authenticity resonated far beyond political divides. Meanwhile, Conway's spin, once considered untouchable, was being labeled outdated, a relic of an era when slickness could pass as strength. Critics pointed out that her arsenal of deflection and wordplay had finally met its match in Crockett's clarity. "The Emperor has no clothes," one headline declared. Another read, "Crockett does in seconds what journalists have tried for years." Even rival politicians, often reluctant to praise their opponents, couldn't resist weighing in. Some applauded Crockett for her bravery, while others issued warnings that this was a turning point. Authenticity and brevity could now outshine decades of polished spin. The moment became bigger than the room. It became a cultural flashpoint. It wasn't just about Crockett versus Conway anymore. It was about a new energy surging through American politics, one that rewarded truth over spectacle, directness over deception, courage over calculation. By the end of the week, Crockett's name had skyrocketed in search trends. Her social media accounts gained thousands of new followers each day. Grassroots supporters flooded her with messages, donations, and encouragement. To many, she wasn't just a politician. She was a symbol of what politics could be when stripped of arrogance and grounded in conviction. Conway, on the other hand, faced the opposite ripple. The clip became her most replayed, but not for the reasons she would have wanted. Instead of showcasing her mastery, it highlighted her unraveling. For someone who had built a career on always having the last word, this was an uncharacteristic, undeniable defeat. In living rooms, classrooms, and office break rooms, people replayed the exchange, laughing, cheering, and shaking their heads in disbelief. "Did you see that?" became a refrain across the country. The moment wasn't just news. It was a shared cultural experience. And in that experience, Jasmine Crockett had stepped from being just another voice in the political arena into something much larger, a symbol of defiance, clarity, and courage in an age too often drowned out by noise. When the cheers died down and the echoes of Crockett's words settled into memory, something profound remained in the air, a lesson larger than any single argument, larger than any clash of personalities. Because what Jasmine Crockett accomplished in those fleeting seconds was more than a rebuttal. It was a reframing of what confrontation in politics could truly mean. For too long, Americans had grown accustomed to manipulation dressed as debate. Kellyanne Conway embodied that archetype: clever phrasing, endless pivots, answers that sounded polished but left truth buried beneath layers of spin. She was not the first, nor would she be the last, to master that art. And yet, Crockett's response revealed something timeless and deeply human. That beneath all the noise, all the rehearsed lines, all the theater of politics, dignity and courage still mattered. Her clapback was not drenched in hostility. It wasn't a screaming match, nor a desperate scramble for attention. It was steady, precise, and unflinching. It reminded everyone watching that the most powerful weapon in any confrontation is not volume, but clarity. Not clever deception, but truth delivered without fear. And that's why it struck so deeply. In an age where political discourse often feels like a shouting contest, Crockett's words prove that one doesn't have to match arrogance with arrogance. One doesn't have to descend into the mud to expose manipulation. Sometimes the simplest expression of truth, spoken with conviction, can dismantle even the strongest seeming walls of deception. This was the universal lesson rising out of that room. When courage confronts arrogance, courage wins. When authenticity meets manipulation, authenticity endures. And when truth is spoken plainly, it cuts through the fog like sunlight breaking the storm. But there was another layer too. This was not just about two individuals on a stage. It was part of a larger story, one unfolding across American politics. A story of new voices rising, voices less interested in rehearsed talking points and more invested in real accountability. Crockett represented that resilience, that unyielding insistence that honesty has a place in the halls of power. In her, many saw not just a politician but a reminder of their own fight, to be heard, to be respected, to stand firm even when the odds tilt against them. Her victory in that moment was not simply personal, it was collective. It belonged to every underdog who has ever been dismissed, every truth-teller who has ever been drowned out, every person who has felt silenced by those who mistake cleverness for wisdom. And that is why the moment lingered long after the applause faded. It became a kind of moral compass, pointing toward a future where debates aren't just battles of spin, but opportunities for truth to rise. As the days passed, as the clips replayed on loop and the hashtags trended, one line captured the spirit of it all. It wasn't just about Conway losing an argument, it was about America reclaiming its voice. Because at its heart, that's what it was. Not a spectacle, not a skirmish, but a reclamation. A reminder that politics doesn't have to be a performance of deception, but can still be a platform for truth. And that truth, once spoken, reverberates far beyond the stage. It empowers, it inspires, and it endures. Jasmine Crockett may not have set out to create a cultural flashpoint, but in those few seconds of fearless clarity, she lit a path forward. A path where dignity overpowers arrogance, where courage dismantles manipulation, and where America, weary of noise, can once again hear its own voice ringing clear. And so we return to where it all began. That headline moment the world will remember. Jasmine Crockett destroys Kellyanne Conway's argument in seconds. Because that's exactly what happened. Not in hours, not in some drawn-out exchange, but in mere seconds. Crockett dismantled the myth of Conway's invincibility. What once looked like polished confidence crumbled under the weight of fearless authenticity. This wasn't just Crockett scoring points in a debate. It was a reminder etched into history that truth will always outshine deception. That courage, spoken with clarity, will always resonate louder than spin. And that in the arena of politics, where manipulation has too often reigned supreme, dignity still has the power to win. But here's where you come in. Moments like these don't just happen. They live on because people like you refuse to let them fade. Every share, every comment, every subscription is more than support for this channel. It's part of a bigger movement, amplifying the voices who speak truth to power and reminding the world that spin cannot stand unchallenged. So if this moment moved you, if it reminded you why clarity and courage matter, hit subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Add your voice to the growing chorus demanding honesty in our public square. Because in the end, politics isn't just about who wins a debate, it's about who shapes the future. And as Jasmine Crockett proved, sometimes all it takes is a few fearless words to change everything.